Everyone who knows who the Mandalorians were knows that they were fairly brutal people, as, in fairness, you have to be if you plan on going toe-to-toe with Force wielders. But the details of that brutality aren't really common knowledge, so when Star Wars The Clone Wars gave us a glimpse of a Mandalorian Jedi cage, some of you might have been curious about how it worked. The truth is actually quite horrifying and has its roots in the long conflicts between the Mandalorian and the Jedi. So strap in, because today we're going to talk about Mandalorian torture techniques.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Let's start with a bit of Mandalorian history. Mandalorians first encountered the Jedi around the end of the Mandalorian Crusades, when Mandalore the Indomitable was leading his warriors on a campaign across the Republic. They clashed with the Jedi several times during these campaigns, but didn't develop all that much of an understanding of them and their techniques. This proved useful to Ulic Qel-Droma, fallen Jedi and newly anointed Sith Lord, who at the time was looking for an army. He challenged Mandalore to individual combat and ended up defeating him, leading the Mandalorians to swear allegiance to him and the Brotherhood of the Sith. Under Qel-Droma and Mandalore the Indomitable, the Mandalorians helped wage the Great Sith War, a conflict in which the Sith nearly destroyed both the Republic and the Jedi Order. The Brotherhood of the Sith, for those unaware, was the Sith Order founded by Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma right before the start of the Great Sith War. This was in no small part due to Mandalore the Indomitable and his Crusaders, who joined the Krath cult, the Massassi warriors of Yavin 4, and armies of fallen Jedi as part of the Brotherhood's loose alliance. The Mandalorians fought for the Sith on Forost, Coruscant, and Onderon, in battles that made them well known as deadly warriors across the Republic. The Mandalorians fought many Jedi during the Great Sith War, but they were frequently defeated. While Qel-Droma had taught them a bit about the Jedi and their techniques, he hadn't taught them too much for fear of betrayal, and it left the Mandalorians at a bit of a disadvantage. Jedi killed many Mandalorian Crusaders and eventually stopped their advance entirely. When Mandalore the Indomitable was killed on the Dark Sun Moon in the Battle of Onderon, the Mandalorians abandoned the Sith and retreated to their homeworlds. It didn't take long for Mandalore the Ultimate to gather the scattered clans and start a new crusade, which evolved into the Mandalorian Wars. That conflict was a time of change for the Mandalorians. Under Mandalore the Ultimate, they began to allow members of other species to join the clans, and they also adapted their armor and weapons and how they waged war. In just a few decades, the Mandalorians transformed a band of nomadic crusaders to a war machine rallying to crush the weakened Republic. Part of this adaptation involved learning how to deal with the Jedi. Determined not to be bested again, the Mandalorians studied the Jedi, changing their tactics to be able to counter them more effectively. The Neo-Crusader armor that most Mandalorians began using in this period was practically a full shell of Beskar as opposed to the lighter armor suits the Crusaders had worn, an adaptation intended to exploit Beskar's resistance to lightsabers to the fullest. Mandalorians began using swords with Beskar or Cortosis weaves, which would allow them to parry lightsabers, and some began using jetpacks as well, which allowed warriors to get some distance from Jedi opponents if need be. But the Mandalorians weren't just trying to figure out how to best fight the Jedi. They didn't just want to kill them, they wanted to understand them, and to do so, they had to capture them. Obviously, this is much easier said than done, but they did eventually devise their own methods of keeping Jedi captive. They figured out ways of restraining Jedi that would prevent them from using the Force to escape, often involving rather elaborate methods. This is where we come back to the Siege of Mandalore. After Maul's capture in the Siege of Mandalore, the Mandalorians stick him in what the concept art for the episode labels a Mandalorian sarcophagus, a device they say was designed to hold captured Jedi, made during the Old Wars. While they don't elaborate on how it worked in the episode, the name gives us a bit of a dark hint. A sarcophagus is a type of elaborate coffin that several ancient civilizations used for dead rulers, which were often laid in elaborate tombs. Now, this could easily be metaphorical. Perhaps the Mandalorians just locked their prisoners in tomb-like vaults, keeping them in suspended animation in these sarcophagi until they had a use for their prisoners. But there's actually cause to take the name quite literally. The Mandalorians were indeed known to bury people alive as a form of torture. This is a very real and horrible technique. Burying someone alive exploits a whole host of instinctive fears that humans have, including fears of enclosed spaces, being unable to move, starvation, isolation, darkness, suffocation, and more. Mandalorians weren't known to bulk from such extreme forms of torture, and they probably saw this as more efficient than horrible. The Mandalorians used such tactics to break the minds of prisoners, either to make them more pliable or just for some sick version of fun. Typically, the Mandalorians used this technique on beings with unusual capabilities. This included Force sensitives, of course, but it also included members of species like the Gendai, who were basically walking nerve clusters and thus nearly impossible to properly kill. The most notorious of Gendai, Dirge, had a long-standing grudge against the Mandalorians, which led him to killing Mandalore a few centuries before the Clone Wars. When the Mandalorians subsequently captured Dirge, they did their worst to him and then buried the remains. Dirge regenerated from the wounds they inflicted, as they knew he inevitably would, but they buried him pretty deep beneath the surface, and as a result, it took a full 60 years for him to regenerate enough to be able to dig himself out of the ground. It's not out of the question that he was buried in a sarcophagus just like the one used to transport Maul. That gives us another question to consider. Why exactly did the Mandalorians take prisoners at all? The answer is fairly simple. The Mandalorians were fascinated by the Force, even as many of them hated it and considered its users cowards. Especially during the Mandalorian Wars, they wanted to understand how the Force worked and how the Jedi were able to use it. Their lead researcher in this field was the infamous Dr. Demogol, a Mandalorian surgeon who, together with Cassius Fett, was one of Mandalore the Ultimate's top lieutenants. When the Mandalorian Neo-Crusaders finally launched their attack against the Republic, the Jedi Council insisted on staying out of the fight, but a number of Jedi disobeyed their orders and went out to the front lines anyway. Between them and some Jedi that had just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, the Mandalorians ended up capturing quite a few. At Mandalore's behest, all captured Jedi were shipped off to Demogol, who was intent on studying them. Demogol's methods of study weren't pleasant either. Suffice to say that this guy never took the Hippocratic Oath. He didn't bother with anesthetics or anything like that, and he vivisected his captives, which is to say, he cut them apart while they were still alive and awake. Demogol was known to perform all sorts of incredibly unethical experiments, all of which typically left his subjects dead, if only after enduring a great deal of pain. Demogol did what he did in a bid to figure out what made the Jedi tick. The Mandalorians never had much of an understanding of the Force, and they didn't care too much about the philosophical side of it. They were focused entirely on the practical side of the Force, on finding ways of stopping Jedi from using their Force powers or allowing Mandalorian warriors to use them as well. Demogol's research was cut short due to the interference of Zane Carrick, and the Mandalorians never succeeded in figuring out how to reproduce Force powers on a mass scale. But Demogol's research wasn't entirely in vain, and he did discover methods of nullifying Force powers. Those methods came in handy for the Mandalorians, who would go on to wage war against the Jedi and Sith alike at various points over the course of the next few thousand years. Their research into Force sensitivity likely continued into these periods as well, and they developed new methods for both fighting and imprisoning Jedi, including sarcophagi like the ones seen in the Clone Wars. We don't know when those particular devices started to see use, but the sarcophagus used to transport Maul was made centuries after the Mandalorian Wars, judging by the helmet designs seen on it. At the earliest, it could have dated back to the Great Galactic War, which took place about 3,600 years before the Clone Wars. So that's the true purpose of Maul's Mandalorian sarcophagus. It was used to torture captive Jedi who were likely being held for experimentation. But as per usual guys, we want to know your thoughts. Would you like us to take a closer look at Mandalorian history in the future? Feel free to post your thoughts in the comments section below. And as per usual guys, just before you go, make sure you check out all those links in the description below if you do want to join the wider Geetsly's community. If you want to chat to me and chat with other Star Wars fans, we have our main Geetsly's Discord server. If you want to just play games with other Star Wars fans, we do have our Geetsly's Gaming Network as well. And if you want to help support the channel more than you already are by watching this video, please do check out the Patreon. Every dollar helps improve the quality and quantity of videos produced on this channel. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.